The next economic time bomb is right here, and here, and peppered across the entire United States. The Suburban Office Park.
Suburban office parks are still hanging on, largely because over half of existing leases were signed before 2020. But once those leases are up, it could be an economic disaster. Not for the companies that leave the office parks behind, but for the retirement funds and pension funds that invest in commercial property, or for the many communities and towns that rely on a steady stream of property tax revenue from these offices. So these started popping up all over in the latter half of the 20th century, but they really found their footing with the next beat of this story. Say it with me. The 1980s. In 1979, even with all the hoopla surrounding the suburbs, 74% of office space was still found in central cities. But by 1999, that figure had dropped to 58%. Basically, developers all over the United States went absolutely bananas building so many office parks. The square footage of suburban office space increased by 279% between 79 and 89, absolutely wiping the floor with the paltry 90% increase in central cities. In New Jersey alone, whose state flag might as well be a suburban office park, developers built in the ballpark of 90 to 100 million square feet of office space in the 1980s alone, accounting for 80% of the state's total office square footage, even up through 2014. To explain this construction bonanza in the 1980s, I consulted some economic smarty-pantses who wrote about it in the late 1990s. The world's major economies were in the longest upturn of the post-1945 era, following the severe recession of the early 1980s. Substantial growth in the service sectors, credit was easy to come by, and widespread optimism that governments had finally cracked the mystery of sustained growth by allowing free rein to markets. And secondly, in the US specifically, there was the Economic Recovery Act of 1981. This measure's aim was to decrease marginal tax rates by liberalizing the depreciation of deductions and changing the capital gains rules for real estate. Translation? Developers could suddenly save big on their tax bills by writing off a lot more of their property's total value up front. Translation for the translation? Kind of a tax shelter of sorts. And why the suburbs specifically? Well, more room to build, first of all. And secondly, the brainy youngsters of the 1980s still largely preferred the suburbs over cities, which were seen as these sort of grimy, crime-ridden relics of the past.
So office parks like these popped up all over the outer rings of American cities and towns. They were certainly a far cry from the sprawling, duck pond-filled estates of an earlier era, but they served their purpose well enough.
And all these employees gathering in central locations allowed for other businesses to pop up around them, like retail stores, restaurants, gyms, etc. And they all provided a nice, steady stream of tax revenue for the towns and communities where they existed. But here's the problem. After the 1980s and 90s, a new crop of brainy youngsters grew up, started working, and started exerting their working preferences onto the economy. Millennials. Their preferences didn't include suburbia at all, let alone suburban office parks.
As vociferously as their forebears embraced suburbia, millennials rejected it, opting instead for revitalized urban centers.
By 2005, national office vacancy rates in downtowns were 14.9% and 16.7% in the suburbs. By 2010, following a brutal recession that decimated suburban businesses in particular, that number was still 14.9% for downtowns, but had jumped to 19% for suburbs.